Gut, dann würde ich sagen, machen wir weiter mit dem Blog. Also wir waren ja letzte Vorlesung, glaube ich, mittendrin stehen geblieben. Und ich würde ganz gerne den Blog noch zu Ende bringen, weil er auch relevant ist für die Hausaufgabe. Ich glaube, wir waren hier. Und ich glaube, ich mache so ein bisschen Theorie, aber vor allen Dingen viel Live-Demo. Also wir gehen jetzt mal ein bisschen durch die Vorlesungen hier. Ich glaube, ich hatte schon mal erklärt, dass man beim Schreiben eines Tests meistens so vorgeht, dass man diese 3 Schritte hat: Arrange, Act, Assert, wo man halt eben ein System das rede ich auf Deutsch. Ich sollte auf Englisch reden. Okay, I'm going to start in English. So usually you have those 3 steps with software testing: arrange, act, assert, where you bring the system into a state first, then you do something, you make an action, and then you assert the result, for example. And this is on the right side. This is like an example of such a test case where you have some sort of test setup. In this case, this is a test for, you go to a website, and after some timeout, you scroll down to a particular part of the website. So you will have to somehow mock the URL, which is, let's set up in this case, which has an anchor. And then you basically just do something, which is, in that case, you mock a timer. And then you expect something, which is here. This is like a very a pattern that you can apply to basically all software tests. Almost all software tests work like that. There are a few exceptions. In some languages, you have so-called mocks, which you have to set up before you do the action, which are like of intercepting a method call, and later on can tell you whether they were called or not. And here they just has mocks that you have to set up first, and then you can call them later. You can ask them, have you been called? Which is nice, because then you can put the assertion at the end. And another thing which is also important is that you can use your software test as part of the documentation. So for example, here we have the command line output of a test run, which is testing one component. In this case, it's a form where you type in a slug. So that's a URL safe or URL friendly version of a username. And this should be unique, because the slug is in the URL. It's a part of like a URL like profile / and then slug. So slug needs to be unique, because otherwise you would have unexpected behavior. You have the same slug for 2 users. And so the form should, first of all, check if it's all URL safe, and then have some special cases, what happens when the slug is already taken. So in this case, backend tells you, okay, we have a server, and the server knows all the slugs and tells you this slug is already taken or not. And this is a nice way of structuring your code to document even those special cases, right? So you have these the default behavior, checking the slug itself, but then some test like exceptions. What happened if the slug is already taken? Then it should reject. So the form is invalid. It will give you some sort of error message, or if it's the user himself, then it's fine, for example, right? So also think of your software test as part of the documentation, which is resembling this part here, all right? Then what I also like is to slightly change. When I write a test, you can already see that this is like something like a hierarchy. You start from the most general setup, and then you change the setup slightly, and then you have other test cases which are expecting this this test setup. And if you do this nesting of test cases, you end up with like a tree-like structure of test cases. And I like to do that because you can highlight the differences in the tests. So what exactly changes, or what what exactly is relevant in order to change a particular expectation, right? So I think the example on the right side is doing that here. So the two last test cases are on this slide. So you can see we have some slug, and we mock the backend result. So we just pretend the backend would return with a slug, which is called which has the value already taken, and then you can decide, well, it should in general reject if the slug is the same, or if it's the current user, then it should be okay, right? So the nice part here is that you can see like the differences. You change the test type slightly, but the expectation almost stays the same, but with a different value. Like here it's throwing an error, and here it resolves to undefined, which is not throwing an error, meaning it validates, right? So this is something I like to do, which is particularly possible with test frameworks like Jest or in Ruby RSpec. And there are test runners that don't have this feature, that you can have nested test cases and you can slightly change the setup to highlight the differences. This is very important for other developers, because another developer can have a look into the code and immediately you see, okay, when I change that, then this will happen. And which is compare that to a situation where you have a test setup which consists of 5 lines, and then you have to repeat them. Then sometimes it's not as obvious to see which of the lines of the test setup are relevant for the particular test case, which I'm doing right here. Are you still with me regarding that? Does it make sense? Yeah, in the public chat, I see that people are talking about what is a slug. I think slug translates to Schnecke in German. I always ask myself who came up with that name. It's usually, it refers to a string which is like URL friendly and better than like just a number for the ID. All right, so it looks good so far, right? We're just doing some theory here, and you will see we will do the live demo later on. That's also one tip of mine. A lot of developers feel tempted to write abstract code. And software tests are usually really simple, and they might be very verbose. They might have a lot of redundancy. But in contrast to your production code, which you are testing, which should always like try to avoid redundancy, redundancy in test cases is not necessarily a bad thing. Especially when you would write something like this here, which is not as easy to immediately understand what's going on here, right? So you have to really look through it and then see, okay, so we are iterating through an array, and for each of those attributes, we create a test case on the fly. And we also like generate the test case description here. I often feel tempted to do something like that for test cases that are very, very similar. But in most cases, it's best to actually just write it all down like this, because it's so much easier to immediately understand, right? All of these tips here should help the developer who's coming after you to understand your test case, right? Documentation, very important. It's try to write a test case as if you would talk to your coworker, right? And try to make a test case as easy to read as possible. Most of these suggestions, most of these tips are also resembled by a link, which I put to from switching so many slides. Okay, I put it at the end. I'm sorry. So there's an amazing list of best practices which I linked on the slide. And like, yeah, why not just check it out? Hang on for a second. JavaScript best practices. Let's share the screen for the first time. GitHub. JavaScript best practices. Okay, going to share my screen. Is it that one? I'm not 100% sure if it's actually the right link. I don't. Okay, it's actually something else. So GitHub gave me another set of best practices. So I don't know about this one here, but why not? There are many more lists of best practices. I've just checked this one, and yeah, and it's this set of best practices is really trying to explain you that software tests should be as simple as possible, and yeah, using the arrange, act, assert pattern, and so on and so on. So most of my suggestions are not something that I came up with myself, but are like best practices, which are, yeah, like a convention in software development. You should check that out. It's amazing. And there's like a lot. And as you have seen, there's even more. If you just type in software testing best practices into Google. Okay. And another thing is you can also test your tests, which is called mutant testing. So in order to make sure that your tests are actually doing what they are supposed to do, you can try to introduce a bug in your production code and then check if the bug in production code will let a test case fail. If that doesn't happen, then you found a bug in your test case because the test case is supposed to fail. If it doesn't, you have a problem. You need to check if the software test is implemented in a wrong way, or maybe you need more test cases. And then it depends. Like this technique is called mutant testing, and I do that a lot, especially when working with legacy code. Because when you work with legacy code and you write the test case afterwards, you must make sure that the test case are doing what they are expected to do. Otherwise, you risk you have a risk that you think that it's testing what it should, but you never know because the test case might never have been failing, right? It was green from the beginning for some reason or another. If you do test-driven, then your test will be red in the beginning. You add the production code, the test turns green, and that already is like a nice insurance for you. Okay, the test case is actually doing what it's supposed to do. When you do the test case later on and you have the production code in already, for example, when you work on legacy code, then you need to do a lot of mutant testing. And another really nice tip, which I already saw in one review, so I gave a review just before the lecture, is don't do accessing internal state of the things that you're testing. For example, when you're testing a view component, then you use your test utils, and your test utils gives you this wrapper object which you can inspect. And of course, you can do something like that. You can go to wrapper.vm and check what's in the reactive state of the wrapper. Much better is that you actually test what you can see, right? The component will render some HTML or will render some text. In this case, maybe your component is showing an input field if it's in edit mode, right? So instead of checking the property that will be used in your template to show the input field or not, just check if the input field is there, right? It's a great way of avoiding false negatives, so test cases which are green, but in fact the production code is somehow broken. For example, let's say you would never do something with the property, right? So the input field is never there because it's never being rendered. This test case here will succeed, will pass, even if there's never an input field, because you just you're checking the property, which might be there, but it's never rendering the input field. Does that make sense? while you're doing the results, I'm checking the chat. Yeah, exactly. Elias is typing, so many developers fail into the trap of doing don't repeat yourself in the software testing, which is nice for production code, but in software tests, it's better to have low complexity and best readability. Okay, looks good so far. And that's already, okay. We have some more suggestions, but I think I'm gonna do the live demo now already. Having those suggestions in. Can you see my screen? No, you can't. Now you should see my screen. So do I have test set up here from last lecture? Seems so. Yes, nice. Okay. So we had, I think we stopped here. Oh no, that's the example spec of a component. Anyways. That's okay. The slides. So let's see those suggestions in action. So writing nice or hierarchic test cases. Yeah, in general, I think last time we did something like this. We had function increment IDs, which was taking a list and then incrementing those IDs or these items, assuming that these the items would be numbers. Item plus 1, and then we were like writing a test case. What I like to do is I try to start with what I'm testing. Like I'm describing what I'm testing. In this case, I'm testing the method called or the function called increment IDs. And then I give it a callback or like a function, this one here, which is then wrapping my test cases. A test case can be written either with test or with it. This is like a global, which just knows. And then I can describe what it should do. So for example, increment IDs should return another list with each item plus 1 something. Well, that's bad English. Increment IDs should increments every item in the list by plus 1. I think that's better. All right. And then I can test expect increment IDs 1, 2, 3 to equal 2, 3, 4. Oh, I have a syntax error somewhere. I'm missing parentheses. Where do you run test unit? To equal is not a function. Yeah, because I put the parentheses at the wrong place. It should be here, right? So my subject on the test is a function call of increment IDs here. That's what's in the expect. And then I'm having an assertion. Yeah, and as you can see, it's already like showing me the test case description. The first thing that you should try to do is make this text read nicely. Okay, this is probably suggestion number 1. Try to use your test as a documentation. So spend some time to write nice reading test case descriptions. All right. I think suggestion number 2 was you can nest your test cases. Let's say we have another parameter increment or addition. What's the best English here? I don't know. Addition. And then I can, for example, say describe. That's like the default case. I put the describe here, so I'm nesting it again. Given addition equals, I don't know, 2. Increments every item in the list by +2, for example. All right. That should have a failing test case, yes. And in order, for example, to, well, I could probably share the test case setup here. It's not as obvious in this case, test case, because it's only one line. So in reality, I would probably not do that for just a one-liner, right? So for a one-liner, it's fair enough. But let's assume you have like 5 lines of code before you would run your actual action, right? So let's say you have a lot of JavaScript code, which might be different or which might be complex. Then you can put that somewhere here, right? The idea is that you can share the test setup and add test case what's actually relevant in this scope, right? Or maybe in this test case. Another change relevant to this test case. The idea is that you can communicate with your developer that only what actually changes should have an effect on the expectation. So in this case, for example, if we say given addition is 2, the idea is that addition is the value for what should be added to the list. The idea is that you only have in this block where you say given addition 2, you have something like addition equals 2, for example. So you set it to 2, and that is like that's then relevant for all test cases within this block. So when you read the software tests as another developer, it's easier for you to immediately see what's relevant, what's changing the behavior of the function, right? Otherwise, if you have a flat structure, you would have to repeat that over here, right? Because you have to do it for every test case, which is not the worst thing on earth, but I like to do that. Like, that's my motivation of having nested test cases and sharing some of the test case setup. I'm trying to check if that's understandable for you with another poll. Are you good with that? Okay. Yeah, I think I saw 3 people saying that wasn't so.
I have a question.
Obvious, yes.
So you have this before each function call here. So does this before each call apply to the test method above the describe that it's nested in?
No. So I don't have a before each. Yes,
oh, you had it on the slide. You had it on the slide, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. So before each applies to the code block here. So this, can you see my cursor?
Yes, I can.
So this is a block, and if I put a before each here, then the before each will run before every test case in this block. And I can have multiple before each in every described block. And then they will first run this before each, and then this before each. So the order is from outer scope to inner scope. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's just like every scope, like technically. Yeah, okay.
Basically, yeah. So what you would do is you would indeed put the shared setup here and only do what's actually changing here, right?
Okay, thanks.
Welcome.
What does happen if there is like a mutation in the second before each? Does it override a variable which is also in the first before each, or is this a conflict? Is this possible to manipulate something in the second before each for the second test?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And what you're describing is a real problem, and we'll come to that later. This is called a non-atomic test. We talked in the chapter of functional programming, we talked about impure functions which might have some side effect. And this, what you described, is the definition of a side effect. So I have maybe some state, right? So if this is some state, why not just uncomment it? This would change some state, obviously, because it's like a local variable, which we can declare here, right? So this local variable is available to all the blocks in here because it's declared at the outermost scope. And if I change that state somewhere in here, obviously this might have a side effect on all the other test cases. And your job as a good software developer is to try to avoid unintended side effects, right? And we call a test case which is interfering with another test case. We call it an atomic test case. I think we'll come to that later, but that's a real problem. Yes. So does it answer the question for now?
Yes, it does.
Nice.
Thanks.
So I actually have a follow-up question.
Yes.
It's tightly related to the last one. So you have with the view test utils package, you have this function called shallow mount.
Yes.
And you can effectively mount a component without mounting its child component, so they get stubbed.
Yes.
Now, isn't that by definition a side effect? Because the child because our system isn't behaving as it would if its children were there. So it's kind of like a side effect inside the test because you're not really testing the children, which actually have side effects with their parent per definition.
Well, yes. I would say, I don't know. I would say it depends. I would ask myself if rendering the child component has an effect on the parent itself. Like, obviously, you could do something like when the component is rendered, then immediately it emits some event, which is then consumed by the parent or something like that. And yes, you're changing the behavior in that case, but then you have also like tightly coupled components. Like the child component is really tightly coupled with the parent, which is probably a bad practice, I would assume. And usually the parent component should be independent of child components. You should be able to render a parent component somehow, and it should be fine. Maybe it's not rendering child components if it doesn't have them. But you see the point? Or does it? Do you have like? Did I express myself?
No, actually, you're right. I think you're right. Yeah, because then we will have the children and the parents tightly coupled, which is not what we want. And
yeah, I think it's
if you stub them. So if you stub them, the component should also work. That's the definition of shallow mount. Even if you remove its children, it should still perform its logic.
Yeah, I think that's the idea of having shallow mounts. Most component tests, or maybe it's good practice to use shallow mounts to make sure that they're not the components are not tightly coupled. For most of the component tests, only the behavior within the component matters, and you don't need to access with child components in order to check something in the parent component. Sometimes this is necessary. If you think of our exercise, where you have where you click on like submit your news item, and you want to expect that this will add another item in the parent component, maybe you need to like mess around with the child component. So for example, yeah, you're creating a new component and then you're expecting it's appended to the list in the parent component. You could probably do that, yeah. So you write an integration test, obviously, because you're testing many components, how they interact, and then you're rendering the entire component tree. So you're using mount instead of shallow mount. And then you have this nice form, so you can find the input field here. And then you type something in there, and then you click this button, and then you could write an assertion. Now I should see another header element with the title that I just put in before. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that would be an example of a valid use case where you want to use mount and you want to interface with child components. But yes, it's best to, well, just have some kind of intuition. Usually you're testing the behavior within the component itself, not so much how, like, you could, in the same way, you could, for example, just call, you could just emit the event, right? If your interface is the event that the parent component is listening to, you can just emit some data and then expect that it's rendering a new component. Does that make sense?
Yes, maybe. So let's say I'm in the form component. Then if I try to test whether an element is put in the list and I stub the child components, then I technically can't test the only functionality that my form has, which means that the form will only effectively be tested in the integration tests.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. So the form is, you need the form in order to basically emit this event by clicking on the button. But what you can also do is you can just don't render the form at all and immediately emit, like tell the parent component, I am emitting this event, which would create a new item without this component. Yeah, this component is emitting an event which this parent is listening to, but you can shallow mount this parent component and just emit the event somehow in your test. You can like simulate it, and then you see another item being added to the list. That would be.
But then I would have to make an assertion that the list has put a new item inside the form testing, which isn't correct, is it?
Say it again.
Then, so if I need to check that the element was actually put in the list while testing the form component, I'd have to check if the list put it in. But then I'm testing the list component inside the form component.
Yes. Yeah, now you're confusing two things. I was always shallow mounting the parent component, never the form component.
Yeah, okay.
So it's not the responsibility of the form component to add anything anywhere. So the only thing that you can test with your form component if it's emitting what it should emit when you when you hit the create button. So then you would shallow mount only that part. But when you, let's say, you shallow mount the list component and you don't have a form to click on, then you can like simulate the event being emitted. That would be one thing.
Okay, I think I understand now. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So two ways like achieving the same result. I believe that for most people it feels more natural to use mount because it's what you would see when you use the application. But you can also shallow mount and then have dependencies. Another great use case for shallow mount is if you would have to set up some dependencies, which you don't have if you can just stub out those components. let's say you shell amount this list and you have some translation, right? Some of the text is being translated, then you need to set up this dependency. But if you're just stub out the component, there's nothing that's being translated, and then you don't have any errors, right? So if you can, when you stub out child components, you stub out all the dependencies that you would need to set up for the child components as well. That's where I'm using shell amount very often, right? If I don't want to set up all the dependencies, I'm just saying, oh, shell amount. I'm only interested in the behavior of that component anyways. Forget about these components. And yeah, does it make sense? Another example of how to use shell amount, or whether that makes sense. Maybe I should make a poll if most people you were understanding what we were talking about. There's one message in the public chat. Is it sufficient if we test mutations to the list through methods, or should we test with events as well? I would say it's up to you. So there's a question for the homework. We have a feature. You see a message when the list is empty. So instead of seeing nothing, you see a message, I am empty. And you can, for example, that's how I did it. I just gave the list component a property where I can initialize the initial items. And then I initialize it with an empty list. And boom, there you have your message, right? Other groups, I already saw that, were staying with the initial set of 3 items, which you don't have to, right? But yeah, you can also try to click the remove button 2 times. Then your list is also empty, or 3 times. Or you can simulate an event being emitted, which would remove those items, right? But that's more effort. I just used a property. I introduced a new property on my list component, and I can then set the property that I'm in the test case itself. I hope that answers the question.
You can also pass the data inside the mock function as a second argument, actually, too. So you can initialize it with different types of data for each test if you want to.
Yeah, but it's of course more cleaner to use properties, because when you change the data, then you're interfering again with internal state of the component. Usually you wouldn't change the reactive state from outside, from the case. But yeah, so it would be better to introduce a property here, but still, as you said, you can change the data, the reactive state, if you have to for some reason. If there's something you can test only by changing the data, fair enough. But usually that's not necessary. Okay, there's a lot going on in the chat. Oh yeah, okay, well, wow, the view test features are actually almost discouraging if I'm using shell amount, which I found interesting. Other test runners, I do remember, for example, for React, the test framework there was always encouraging to use shell amount over mount, because obviously shell amount will be much faster in execution, right? You just mount the component that's on the test, not its child components, which is faster. Yeah, but maybe could make the component behave differently from its actual behavior in the wild, let's say, and then make it its natural behavior. Interesting. Thank you a lot for the input. Please put the links in the shared notes. All right, so I'm gonna continue on with the live demo. Where did I stop? Okay, yeah, let's add this, let's change the behavior a little bit. And actually, we don't need that before each block, because we could say, I can call increment IDs just like that. Or maybe, well, why not? Let's always use the same list. List is 1, 2, 3. And introduce it here, like declare it there. And now for every test case, we initialize list to the very same set, with the very same value, right? So list will always be 1, 2, 3. This can be nice also in order to debug, because yeah, I can just call list here, and then list will be different. I don't know if that's actually a good idea because it also adds more abstraction. You have to check as a developer, you would have to check, okay, what's actually a list? Oh, okay, I have to look here. There's what's in a list. Anyways, so that is one way of doing it. And yeah, I think the test case should run fine. Just have one test case which is failing. Yes, so we have one passing test, one failing test. Everything is like, this was just a refactoring in a way. And let's add addition. So I think when addition should be undefined here. We can double check it. Console log addition. Oh. By the way, you can also run only a particular test with, I think it's called -t. I always keep forgetting the command line arguments of Jest, but I think it's -t. And when you give it the test case description, it's running only this test case here, or it should only run this test. Oh, it's skipping everything. Can someone help me? What I was doing wrong? Just run specific test. It's -t. What? Do I have a typo? Increments every item in the list by +1. Weird.
But if you have a test inside a describe, you might have to give it the description first. It says in the same Stack Overflow you just opened.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay, thank you. So I have to put in that here. Well, that's annoying. Anyways. Increment IDs increments every item in the list by +1. Did I forget to save that file maybe?
I think it's still skipped, right?
Help me. Oh boy. Or T to run a single. What was a single test name? What about capital T? Aha. But now I run both. No, that's also not what I was. Okay, I'm confused. I was like, this should work normally. Can someone help? What do people in the chat? What I'm doing wrong here? Okay, I'm currently not able to solve it, but there is a way of telling Jest, please run this test case only. And we should see, what I wanted to show you is that addition is undefined.
Do you need to add the unit keyword?
The unit keyword, what's the unit keyword?
You had to run test and then unit. Do you need to actually add the unit keyword? Can't you just run test -t? So yarn run test and then
I think it's
-v.
defined like that in his package JSON.
Okay.
Yeah, so the yarn run, similar to the
Okay.
npm run, refers to what I put here in the scripts. There.
Oh, yeah, you
so
have test
I have
unit.
search build test unit, and that's just calling it. And on the yarn, all the parameters that I specify on the command line will just be appended here. So if I append the command line parameter, it will just end here. So I'm closing that, you can better see. So anything I will put as a command line parameter will end here. That's, by the way, a difference to npm run. I think npm doesn't have this behavior. Anyways, so, but yeah, you can see what I was trying to do. Remove comments. So addition is undefined, and still everything works normally. So I can, yeah, change addition there. So I changed the test case setup a little bit, and if I implement the production code, then I can see, nice, both test cases are green. No, not a number. What? What's going on here? Now I'm super confused. What?
But addition is not a number.
Say it again.
The addition variable is not a number because you haven't initialized it.
But I thought I initialized it here.
But it's in the outer scope.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Oh, you have eagle eyes. What was actually failing is the first test case, not the second one. The second one was passing as expected. This first test case was failing because if I don't initialize it, then of course it's undefined, and number plus undefined returns not a number. And then it also fails the expectation. It's not 2, 3, 4. It's none. You're very you're observing all my actions here. So what I have to do here, of course, is to give it default, or maybe just one on first test case. Yeah, there we go. Right? Nice. Cool. And that's how you can structure your test cases, and it also reads nicely. So you have what you're testing, the subject in the test case comes first. Then you have the first test case, like for the defaults, let's say. Then you change the defaults, and then you have some else, like another result. What you could also do is, what I also sometimes do is I'm describing what I'm changing. So I'm, for example, saying given a list 1, 2, 3, and then this before each is basically communicating what I'm doing in the test case in this block, what I put here as a description. And then I can say, instead of increments every item in the list by +1, I can actually say what's being returned, like this. 2, 4, 5. And for you as the developer, it still reads nicely because you see the actual values. Given that this 1, 2, 3 returns given that this 1, 2, 3 returns 2, 3, 4. But if I change that default argument, then 3, 4, 5, which is still, it reads nicely, I would say. All right. And what else was my suggestion? Yeah, sharing test cases, having less abstraction. It's for you as I know it's quite difficult to understand. Okay, what is good abstraction? What is bad abstraction here? I'm pretty sure that there might be software developers who would argue that this abstraction, this already is kind of an abstraction. This is good. Some developers actually prefer to have everything, all the tests that have enumerated for every test case, right? Also has its benefits. But for me, I found out that I like to have one green test case, one red test case always when I do software testing. So when I implement a production code like this, you saw that I had one test case already, which was testing the default behavior, and then I want to add like one more feature, which is this parameter here, and then I have one failing test case for that first, and then I change just that, and then I have both test cases passing. So that gives me extra security or safety that that I implemented the feature correctly. Because maybe, yeah, if I wouldn't have that test case before with the default argument, then I can be sure that the function is doing actually anything, right? I like to have that tree-like way of like changing the test setup slightly, and if I implement a new feature, then I just add one test case, like having one test case green, and then one test case failing for just what I was like, just the new feature, let's say. I hope that makes sense.
Rob?
Yes?
So we have an additional question, and
Yes.
the question is, so there's this find function, and we can use this find function to basically query for HTML elements inside our templates.
Mm-hmm.
And you suggested that we should use that one instead of the VM internal property to test. Now, actually find is deprecated now and will be removed in future releases of Vue test utils.
Ah, yeah. There you can see I reused the slides from last year. I have to change that in the slides. That's correct. So this is a component here, and then you should say find all component in order to get an array or a wrapper array of components. So newer versions of your test utils are actually distinguishing between finding a component or finding HTML tag with a CSS selector, for example. That's good that you tell me that. Yeah, makes sense, right?
Yeah, but how can we find an HTML tag to test? We can't.
With a CSS selector. So you could, if you know in the test case what HTML my list item renders, then I can also use like a CSS selector, like find h1 or something like that, or find input. That's a CSS selector. Do we have it on as an example? Yeah, this would be a CSS selector. So we are finding an array of buttons here, right? Does it make sense? Does it answer the question?
Well, no, because find is deprecated, so we need to always use find all. Is that what you mean?
No. Let's share my screen and open the documentation of Vue test utils. Vue test utils, find. So we haven't been there yet. So so far I wanted to show you how to do software testing with jest only. So Vue tester comes next, but yeah, why not? If there are questions, then go into the documentation. So we have a couple of methods. So the legacy method call is find and find all. Well, no, they still use it, but they're asking you to not use that for components. So here they're using it for using CSS selectors. So you have a wrapper which has some HTML, and then you can find all div elements. And this, you select the div element. And then you can expect that this element is existing, for example. Whereas with find components, you have two components, maybe one component, which is the component under test, which you mount. And the foo component will render bar as a child component. And then you can call something, you can say something like wrapper find component in the wrapper, which is mounting the foo component, in order to find bar. So Vue test utils is also able to find components in your wrapper by the object that is being exported in this single file component here. Does that make sense?
Yep, I just didn't read the documentation properly. Thanks.
Yeah. So here we have the bar component, which is rendered by foo, and then you can check, for example, that bar exists, right? So This is a test case already, which is just checking the child components is rendered by foo. Fair enough. Oh, and there are other ways of finding components. You can find it by its name. So if you have, it doesn't have this example, but you saw that you can change the name, and then you can use this name in the template, right? And you can also find subcomponents or child components with this syntax here. Or if you have a reference, oh, that's actually too complicated for now. But maybe name is also nice to know that you can do that. So that's like the tag which you would use in your template. All right. Yeah. So since we are already talking about Vue test utils, why not write an actual component test? So this is just Jest, which also highlights that you can just use Jest for anything. Like Jest is just a JavaScript test runner. We will use Jest for backend testing later on. But in this case, we're using it for component testing, like for a front end, we probably use it for component testing. And I think if I just undo it, then we can see how a component test looks like. It's like the automatically generated component test. So we have a component called hello world, which is coming from somewhere. And then they already say hello world. Oh, they actually put the file extension there. Also nice. Why not? Hello world.vue, which is making it clear that we are testing a component here. Nice. And then it renders a property when passed. So apparently this is a piece of text. Yes, it is. This is a string. And then we shallow mount, so we're not rendering any child components if there are any. And then we give it a property called message, and we're just expecting that this text here is somewhere showing up in the template itself. One of my suggestions was not to over-abstract things. In this case, for example, I would like to use hard-coded values. Usually hard-coded values, I feel much more hard-coded values in my expectations than using the same variable that I put in the component. So what you can also do is you hard-code the value here and you say new message, right? Same thing. It's more redundant, of course, but I like to use hard-coded values in my expectations just for the sake of safety, right? I don't want to silently have my test passing. And for example, this can happen. You have, for some reason, you mess up your test code and your variable message, for example, I don't know, you reassign it to empty string for some reason, I don't know. And empty is always present in the text, right? That's one example of a test silently passing. So I can have any text here. This test case will pass. No, because I'm reassigning message, which is a const. Okay. There we go, right? So in any text, empty string is always present, and this might be not as obvious to you. And that's why I like to use hard-coded values, so I can always see, okay, what I'm doing, like new message. That's not an empty string, not at all, and I can be absolutely sure it's testing anything. So let's check the component. When I use CLI, one of my components is being auto-generated, and I already can see the message here. Can you see that? Message is there. So it's doing something. It's rendering a lot. It's rendering a lot of list items and links and whatnot. But it's also rendering this property called message. Now let's do mutant testing. I want this test case to fail so I can actually check if it's checking anything. And in order to do that, I can, for example, just remove that, right? So I'm introducing a bug here. The property is still there. So mounting the component, giving it a property will be fine. But it's not in the text anymore. So there we go. And I can see Jest is now outputting a nice error message here, that we have the actual text being rendered by the component, and you can see the new message is it's not part of this this text at all, right? So this was a mutant test. I introduced a bug, and I'm expecting the test case to fail. If the test case doesn't fail, then I have a problem. All right? Does that make sense? Now, since you asked for it, I would like to show you the difference of shallow mount and mount. So they are using shallow mount, and you cannot see any difference so far. So let's create a new component, child component.
Robert, make sure you don't forget the time. We have 15 minutes left, and last time and also this time, there are, I think, some people that also would like to know more about storybooks. Yeah, just keep that in mind.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I was totally forgetting about the time. Time flies, really. I wouldn't have expected that I'm already, it's so late. All right, Storybook. Yeah, so for the homework, one part is to set up Storybook. And I introduce it to this homework because I want you to get a feeling of interfaces of your components, right? Your properties and your events are the interfaces of your components. And I want you to see or get a feeling how that your components are independent things that you can render on your own. And Storybook is a super nice piece of software, or wrong exercise, sorry. It's a super nice piece of software where you can run your component in something like a sandbox, a playground. And you can play around with properties, and it's used by front-end developers to make sure that your component works in different environments, like it works on different backgrounds. It works even for people who have disabilities. It works, you can interactively play by changing the properties. And I have to admit that Storybook is under heavy development, and you might find outdated documentation. So there's a reason why I added this command here, right? And that's what I did when I was implementing my reference solution. So we can do the same. We can just call npx sb init. SB is short for Storybook. And this will do the setup for us, creating stories for, and also I think adding components along with it. And it should give us a nice default setup. So questions so far while this is installing? Silence. I will not have a look into the chat because I'm sharing my screen. Oh, this takes a long time. Yeah, Storybook is not something specific for Vue.js. Storybook is available for React and Vue.js and more frameworks. Just any kind of framework that has the concept of components.
I've got a question.
Yes, go ahead.
When working with Storybook, we were unsure what exactly the task was. We created storybooks for our components, but was there any functionality that had to be implemented, or any kind of arguments that have to be passed? Because I saw Storybook offers actions as well, like for clicks, for example, so we can interact with the functionality of the click of our component, for example. Or was that something else we have to keep in mind when developing?
Yeah, so regarding the actions, I forgot to add that as a task to the homework. I think in the homework I said you should make sure you should install one add-on and make sure that your component passes all the accessibility tests. So the add-on to be installed is called accessibility A11Y. So the 11 is short for the characters abbreviated. And I think the other task was to make sure that the controls changing the properties, and you can update your component in real time. And regarding the actions, I didn't say anything, but of course it would be nice if you could if you could make sure that the actions are all also like locked to the console. So after running npx init, does it answer the question first of all? So just make sure if you have one component, make sure that you can play around with your controls here, and this updates the component in real time.
Okay, so this is our main task, to just be able to play around with our components.
Yes, that's task one. Another task is you can click or you can interact with the component and you can see the actions being locked. And another one is adding another add-on, which will add another tab here, because I find the accessibility add-on particularly useful, especially for your form and other things as well. And yeah, and it shows you accessibility errors. For example, if you have a button which doesn't have a label, then your accessibility will tell you should have a discernible name. You should add an ARIA label for screen readers, which will explain what's the button about. And you have other nice things here. So you have, for example, oh yeah, you can try out how does the component look on different screen resolutions, but usually you also have a different background here. Why is it not? Ah, there we go. So how does it look on another background? For example, let's say you have a component which has no background and dark font, then you would have a black screen here now, right? You can see the button because it has a blue background and white font. And this, yeah, just imagine you have a paragraph and then you wouldn't see anything. That can highlight, like, that show you feeling how your component behaves in different environments, and it helps you to create really high quality components. Okay, so I suggest to you that you check out the generated code that this npx init command gives you. And I just checked out the button story. So it just generates a folder called stories for you, and you have a button component, and you have the stories file, right? And let's have a look into the stories file. You can basically just grab this, put it next to your component, and basically just change the name of your component to whatever your component is called. Also, don't forget to update the references here, right? So that should be your component, and I think it's also referenced down here. All right. There are two things that are really, really strange. Actually, three. So you have this default export. This is important. And then you have another, for each story, you have separate exports. So this, and this one here correspond with the stories, primary, secondary, large, and small. If I rename, for example, small to some name, then I can see that my story is also called some name. Another thing is, where does these control come from? These controls come from this args thing. This is nothing. This might look really, it's actually a function. So the way how Storybook is like their API is that they want you to add a property called args on the function itself. And then I can, for example, add another property and then give it a string, some initial text. And then it should actually show up here somewhere. Ah, there we go. Some initial text. Of course, this is not connected to the properties of the component because there's no property called another property of the button. This vbind will make sure that all properties in the args will directly be passed on to the component that you're rendering here. So that's the component my button, which you're rendering, and the args are just passed down to the component. So how does the last thing is how does the click event is being captured here? And there's some magic going on, which I actually don't like. I don't like if there's magic going on. That's in the configuration, the global configuration of Storybook. If you let the be in it, generate your code, you will end up with a folder .storybook, which has a file, preview.js, and there's another configuration which tells you like everything that's starting with on is supposed to be an event. And Storybook will make sure to set up event listeners for your component. So just because you have on click here, like this is the event within the component. So button.view has actually an event called on click, right? So that's what's here at on click. But Storybook will also set up an event listener for you if it's starting with on, and you have it here. I really dislike that. I like to be explicit, and that's why I deleted it in for me. Delete the current node, yes. Okay, there we go. Yeah, go away. Don't care. And this is now gone. So now, actually, it should still work fine. Just the events will not be listened on. And what you can do is you add to archetypes your event name, for example, on click, and configuration action on click. So I didn't save it, and that's why when I click on this button, nothing is going on, right? No event is being handled. And actually, you can see that there's no handler for it, because when I click on it, I get this nice runtime error, the invalid handler for event on click. But if I save this file, you see line number 7. I will make this a little bit bigger so you can see. So this will set up the event on the component. This is like the explicit way of telling the button, okay, there's an event listener called on click, and you should call that event listener when you click on the button. Right? So for the exercise, you only have to set up add-on controls and the accessibility add-on. That should be just plug and play. Oh, and one more thing. Okay, what's this strange bind thing here? That's just the JavaScript way of creating a clone of a function. So that's why they are calling it in the generated code, they're calling it this function expression template, because they want to reuse it. And in order to clone the function, they are calling it bind and then empty object. That's a JavaScript way of making a clone of a function, just for you to not be totally confused what the heck is going on with this bind thing. All right. So I think the API of Storybook is really unintuitive, but that's how it is. And what I like about Storybook is the idea of like testing your components in like an interactive way. And I want you to get this experience, but yeah, sorry for Storybook having such an counterintuitive API. So a lot of talk.
I got a question already,
Yes.
as long as nobody else is asking. In your line 16, you were writing the template, an HTML template, and it says in the props you were giving a $sign props in there. So I guess this is some kind of magic function provided by Storybooks. I'm just wondering whether there are other magic keywords like $sign data or something like that we could use.
I mean, vbind is actually something that's coming from Vue.js. So vbind is nothing magical.
Yeah, but the $sign props?
Yeah, I'm not so 100% sure. Yeah, at least Storybook is providing those properties, and this $props. That's a good question. I didn't really check that before, because I was just assuming it's doing exactly that. But actually, I don't know where this is coming from, if it's coming from Vue.js or from Storybook. It's some sort of magic. But yes, you can enumerate the properties as well. So if you just remove this vbind and then $props, you can also enumerate every property that you pass into the component. That's actually even better. Let's share the screen for a second again. So you can enumerate the properties. For example, primary goes to primary. Now I'm just passing one property down to the button component. And I should see when I go to the primary, if I change primary, that makes a difference. Yeah, but everything else, it doesn't, right? So changing the label has no effect. And you can see it here. I broke something now, but you can do the same thing with all those properties, background color, primary label, and so on. If I add label, label, there we go. Then the label is back again. But everything else, no. This will have no effect now. Does it make sense? I'm going to have a quick look into the chat. I think we're at the end of the lecture, right? Wow, 12 new messages.
I think there are no new questions.
Ah, okay. You said you wrote the last message. I was like trying to understand the question, which was actually you. Yes.
Sorry, because in the README it says that we should add Storybook add-ons, which are called add-on essentials, along with add-on ally. And is this what you mean with the accessibility add-on, or is this something else? Because I haven't read anything about an accessibility add-on in the README. Does this maybe is this out, or is it included in this what I mentioned?
Actually, it's not called ally. It's called accessibility. This is an 11, right? It's in English. It's a strange way how English-speaking people are abbreviating long names. So this is the number of characters omitted here. So accessibility is a long word, and they are using A11Y. And you sometimes see this with other things. For example, internationalization is often abbreviated with I18N. Kubernetes is sometimes abbreviated with K8S. What else? Localization, same thing, but I don't know the abbreviation.
Okay.
So that is short for accessibility.
I see. Thanks a lot for the clarification. I did not know that.
Yeah. More questions?
I've got another question because I saw for Storybook for Vue, there's another thing called Stories Off that's able to describe components as well. But
yeah, so I think that's the old API. When you, for example, use the Vue CLI plugin for Storybook, then you will end up with generated code which is using this API. I think it also works, but for my reference solution, I used npx sbinit because I think it's more up to date as far as I know. But yeah, that's what I meant with confusing documentation sometimes, because it's under such rapid development. Does that make sense?
yes, thanks.
Yeah, that's the JavaScript world, folks. JavaScript is the entire community is evolving really fast. We'll have a look into the public chat. Characters should be A10 though.
I think it's an A plus 11 letters. I think that's what it means.
Yeah, there's no L. Like you always use the first and the last character, not the last two characters. So the A10 LY would be true, or would be okay. But English people always abbreviate everything but the first and the last character. I don't like it at all for that very reason. When I talk about things, I use the full name. I don't like abbreviations in general. I don't like when people write MSG, which is short for message. Why not just write message? It's always confusing people. Yeah, more questions. It's past. I feel now fully prepared for the homework. And I will update the slides with new syntax of Vue test utils. Someone is saying something? No? Well, I mean, if that's it, shall we call it a day, Yuri? regarding the lecture at least?
Yeah.
There's someone typing.
Maybe one more thing. As you know, we said that we will already give you a review for the teams that submitted until today, 2 p.m. We have that in mind. We know who you are, and we will review that soon.
Yes, I think there are like 5 or so teams who submitted a pull request already, or 4. Well, okay, I'm going to wait for the last question. Someone's writing something in the chat. Yes, you can always request a review. Let it be for draft PRs or actual PRs. So draft PR is a feature of GitHub signaling that this PR is not ready yet. It was designed for that very purpose, that you can create a pull request, tell someone, hey, can you have a look into my code, even if it's not finished yet, right? So you can always request a review. Why not? I mean, in this case, it's one of the tasks that you should give other teams a review. I think so, right? So that would be a perfect example how you avoid a deadlock. One student in last seminar asked, what if no one is like creating a pull request? Then you cannot give a review to any of those teams, and we have a deadlock for the exercise, right? So you should avoid it. Create a draft pull request, yes. Well, fair enough. I would say let's put an end to the lecture. Thank you very much for coming, and see you in the seminar in 10 minutes from now.